So I'm chatting today with Professor David Wright of the University of Calgary Law School. So David, welcome to the Energy Media interview.
Thanks, Mark. I'm good to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about a proposal that was put out by the Andrew Scheer, the leader of the Canadian Conservative Party, on Saturday about a proposal for a national energy corridor. Now, this is not new. Your colleagues in the School of Public Policy published a paper back in 2016 arguing for a national energy infrastructure or corridor program. The Senate has put out a report on it in 2017. But this is not an issue without, or a proposal without issues and problems. So maybe if you could give me your overview perspective on it.
Sure. Thanks, Markham. Overall, I understand the attraction to this concept because it sounds relatively simple and elegant on the surface, and I think folks can envision it fairly easily. Unfortunately, though, it would be tremendously complex to implement on a number of fronts.
Right. So what might some of those be?
Yeah. So one area that I've been looking at in particular with respect to the corridor project, actually over the summer preceding this announcement, is the duty to consult in relation to the corridor concept and ensuing infrastructure program. So that's one area, but also environmental assessment of projects to come within the corridor would also present a number of challenges and complexities.
So Section 35 of the Constitution requires the Crown to consult with Aboriginal people on resource development projects. How would that play into this energy corridor idea?
Right. So under Section 35, which is contentious and takes conversations in a number of directions, but ought to be approached in a very serious and respectful way, in this context would certainly require the Crown to engage in consultation and probably accommodation activities and steps. With respect to the corridor in particular, without knowing the specifics of the corridor, in other words, would it be enabled through targeted specific legislative action? Would there be an order in council? Would there be a commission set up to try to engage in consultation activities? Without knowing those specifics, it's hard to know exactly when the duty would be triggered, how it would then look in practice with respect to what's sure to be well over 100 different Indigenous communities along the any version of the corridor. And under any circumstance, those consultation duties would be probably so-called deep consultation in nature, meaning that with those many Indigenous communities, there would be significant consultation obligations on the part of the Crown.
Now, that's a really interesting issue because my take on the backgrounder that accompanied the CPC press release was that the party envisions that doing a corridor means you can do consultations once, and then it's basically done, or the major consultations are done. But that doesn't take into account the fact that there will still be opponents to particular projects, even if the corridor were to go ahead. So you'd have dissenting First Nations all along the route, which then triggers the Section 35 requirement for consultations, would it not?
Well, the consultation obligations would be triggered by anything that potentially adversely affects Indigenous rights and interests, even if they're so-called asserted rights and interests along that route. So this is in play very early and in a very certain way right off the bat. I think that assumptions that the duty to consult or consultation obligations could be shortcutted or reduced is not a safe assumption in this context. And so certainly you would have the duty to consult triggered by the corridor, and there are different ways that triggering could happen and what it would look like in practice, depending on whether or not it's a legislative initiative or otherwise, perhaps a regional assessment under the new assessment legislation. But either way, there would be consultation on the corridor, and then no doubt there would be more consultation required as each specific infrastructure project came along. And so
Right.
it's possible that on the whole, looking, say, even 10, 20, 30 years down the track, the total amount of consultation potentially is actually more.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I have a question for you that was not addressed by the CPC proposal, but came out of both the Jason Kenney criticisms of the Trudeau government's approach to Trans Mountain expansion and Andrew Scheer's criticisms, and that is the use of declaratory powers. Because the declaratory powers, as I understand them, is you can move something that's on provincial jurisdiction, you can invoke those powers, and then move it into federal jurisdiction. And of course, much of this corridor from BC to the East Coast would be on provincial land. Could the declaratory powers be used by the federal government to expedite energy corridors?
Sure. A couple thoughts. First of all, I don't have a clear or simple answer to that question. It is tremendously complex. My understanding, based on the early thinking, the recent thinking on the corridor concept, is that this would be in any event federally led. This would be treated as an interprovincial project anyway, akin to a pipeline or interprovincial power line. And therefore, the federal government, and this is openly acknowledged in the School of Public Policy paper from 2006, that the federal government would have the lead role. And so you're probably not in a territory of there needing to be any kind of declaratory power exercised. At some point, as we chat, Mark, we may want to talk about expropriation and unilateral decision-making power on the part of the Crown, because that's in play as well and related to what you mentioned.
Well, let's do that. I have one more question, and then we'll get to that. So,
sure.
My understanding then is that this project corridor would come under Section 9210C of the Constitution, the same federal authority that allows for the regulation of inter-provincial works, anything that crosses a border, right? Is that the case?
That's my preliminary understanding, but again, further research is needed on just simple constitutional jurisdictional issues with respect to this corridor. And so the announcement has caught headlines. I'm not sure what kind of legal analysis underpins the concept, or whether or not it's more of a political announcement with details to follow. Most of my research on it so far has been with respect to the Section 35 dimensions. And of course, the duty to consult is owed by the Crown, either federal Crown or provincial Crown, or both.
Well, what about the issue of Aboriginal title and legal challenges on that grounds or on other grounds? It seems to me that this is one of those ideas that, again, you sound simple, but it seems ripe for litigation by First Nations, Indigenous communities, and others who would oppose it.
Sure. At a high level, let me just say this much. My main takeaway from looking at this with respect to Section 35 is that the legal framework that the courts have developed to understand and address the duty to consult is inherently fact-specific and very contextual in nature. So there's friction between that fact-specific nature of the legal framework and the inherently abstract nature of the corridor, in a way that will make it very difficult for the duty to consult to be discharged in relation to the corridor, and certainly with respect to projects to come under the corridor process.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's shift a little bit over to the Environmental Assessment Act. So we have C69 that was passed very recently. It sets out a new Environmental Assessment Act. The pipeline industry has been very critical of it, says there'll be no new pipelines built under that. So but then the proposal here from the CPC suggests that the corridor idea will make these Environmental Assessment Act applications much less onerous, much more streamlined, is what it suggests. What's your take on that?
I understand the logic, but similar to the broader concept, these appearingly elegant, simple solutions are more complex in practice. I do think that the new assessment regime is probably helpful for this concept, and here's why. First of all, it could be done as a regional assessment or parallel complementary regional assessments under Section 93 of the new Impact Assessment Act. The results of those assessments must be considered in a future assessment under Section 22. So there's a built-in imperative for efficiencies in that regard. And that's with respect to the general environmental assessment, though, assessment of impacts and social impacts. And there's a broader base in the new statute to assess all those impacts, which could feed efficiencies. It's a more difficult side of the context is with respect to consultation with Indigenous peoples, because anytime a new or specific potential harm on an Indigenous community is presented by a new project, then the duty to consult is triggered again. And to the extent that that change has happened or that there's new specificities in the proposal, there's a fresh round of consultation required indeed.
Now, one of the points that's come up, we give almost no attention to this in the media, but provincial environmental assessment acts do come into play. They may not frustrate the federal purpose, but they do come into play. And I noticed that over the last year, the BC government has been working diligently on its new environmental assessment impact. And George Heyman, the environment minister, has kind of hinted that one of the reasons is they want to have a bigger say in, projects like pipelines, and presumably they would use that to maybe try to slow down or frustrate pipeline projects. So what's your take on the provincial role in assessing a national energy corridor?
It's a huge question, and it takes us into the space between law and institutions. And so from a legal perspective, you've got basically 11 different environmental assessment regimes across the provinces, and then 3 across the territories. So 14 in total, and at least one version of the corridor goes all the way to the Arctic Ocean, as I understand it. Under the new federal regime, similar to old regimes, there's lots of space and legal authorities for provinces and the federal government to coordinate and to essentially work together formally. And so what you could see in the corridor context is quite a large agreement to have some kind of joint review panel across many jurisdictions, many devilish details to be worked out, but the space and authorities are there. One interesting aspect of that is that system would have to cover off all the legal duties in those EA regimes across all jurisdictions. And so if BC were to, say, have some kind of leadership role in that, which is unusual because it would probably be the federal government, they would have to be sure that they're covering off all the things required in the Federal Act, and vice versa if the federal government was leading. And if it was some kind of joint panel, they'd have to cover everything and all duties off. So again, easier said than done, but it's fathomable. There is a pathway of the possible, I guess, in that regard, but it would be slow and complicated.
And it seems to me that an activist government, provincial government that wanted to oppose something, and I think BC is just the perfect example because, of course, the NDP government led by John Horgan is propped up, it's minority government, propped up by the BC Green Party, which has made opposition to these kinds of projects a condition of its support. That almost guarantees that, I would think, that they would be obstructionist in terms of negotiating. And then that seems to then drag things out, one would expect. What's your take?
Well, it's a complicated question. I don't have a great answer for you on that one, other than, as you've seen in the major pipeline cases, there are enough legal twists, turns, requirements, duties for there to be litigation on this front. Thinking perhaps more optimistically, or trying to adopt the view of those who might be more optimistic. This is the corridor presents an opportunity to come to a negotiated solution across a whole bunch of different jurisdictions on where it could be and how it might be approached in a way that minimally intrudes on various rights and interests that are at play. Whether or not BC could stop the corridor in its tracks at the border is a complicated and difficult question to ask, so I won't attempt to do so here.
Fair enough. Now, I've been interviewing some lawyers down in the U.S. Who are involved in one way or another, or maybe studying legal challenges to U.S. pipelines, whether they be gas or oil. Mm-hmm. And one of the points that is made over and over again is that the National Environmental Protection Act down there is being mined for opportunities to, challenge the project and kind of nip at its heels and delay it and delay it and delay it. And it seems to me that that approach is being adopted in Canada. Is that the case, and could that approach be used by corridor opponents up here?
That's a good question, Markham. I mean, one way that gets articulated in Canada is what are the litigation triggers? And so certainly one area of concern for those worried about the impacts of the new federal assessment regime, for example, is that there's a broader base for assessment. And so Section 22, which lists the factors to be considered, now has 16 different factors. And then there's the 5-part public interest determination in the final decision-making part under Section 63. So one way to look at this is there are arguably more litigation triggers in the Act. However, the courts have been extremely deferential with respect to how the agency and government has gone about considering those factors and making a final decision. And so while such litigation could be started, there is a strong chance that the court will stay in its deferential mode and that litigation will not be successful. And so this is where, if you're proponents in government, you probably want to be adopting this sort of negotiated solution, proactive mindset, rather than getting into acrimonious or adversarial litigation trenches.
That's all the questions I have, David. Any final thoughts on the CPC's energy corridor proposal?
Well, the only thing I'd add, Markham, and as I think I missed it earlier, is with respect to the power of expropriation and infringement of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And to try to summarize, the current Section 35 jurisprudence essentially ends at a place where, in most situations, the Crown can unilaterally infringe Indigenous rights and interests, and that includes situations of expropriation. The case law is a little bit uneven with respect to whether or not in expropriation context compensation is provided. But either way, there's a bit of a dissonance between the current Section 35 jurisprudence and these high-level law and policy announcements coming from Ottawa and being under the influence of some international law developments. And so it's going to be very interesting to watch how the next federal government, whoever it may be, tries to reconcile the pushes from international law, norms evolution, these recent raising of expectations by the federal government, and then what the jurisprudence today, which is subject to many legitimate critiques by scholars and courts and so on, to see where that ends up in coming months and years. So certainly it's only going to get more interesting from here, let me say that.
Professor Wright, thank you very much. We look forward to your comments on other issues as this election goes along. Thank you for doing this today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Markham.